The Forgotten History of Slavery Around the World, America's Bonus, 3. The First Enslaved Africans in America, The Forgotten 1526 Rebellion, 93 years before 1619. My name is not important, no one wrote it down, but then humans rarely write down the names of mice. Perhaps that is why we notice the people whose names humans forget. I lived aboard ships, Spanish ships, Portuguese ships, ships that crossed between Europe, Africa, and the islands Europeans were beginning to conquer across the Atlantic. I learned to stay hidden, I learned to survive, and I learned to listen. Over the years, I learned Spanish, I learned Portuguese. And from the people carried aboard the ships, I learned words from several languages of Africa. That is how I came to understand a story that many people would eventually forget. It happened in 1526, 93 years before 1619. But before I tell you about those Africans, there is something you should know. They were not the first Africans to reach North America. The free African who came before. Years earlier, I had heard sailors talking about an extraordinary man. His name was Juan Garrido. Garrido had been born in Africa, but he was a free man. He had crossed the Atlantic and eventually joined Spanish expeditions as a conquistador. In 1513, Garrido accompanied Juan Ponce de León to Florida. Think about that. An African man stood on the shores of Florida more than a century before the English colonies became firmly established. And he wasn't a slave. He was a free black man traveling with the Spanish. Garrido returned to Florida with Ponce de León in 1521. Later, he participated in the Spanish conquest of Mexico, received land, married, raised a family, and became known for cultivating wheat. His life reminds us of something important. The history of Africans in early America did not begin with slavery. Africans arrived in the Americas under very different circumstances. Some were free, some became soldiers and settlers, and many others were enslaved. The people whose story I am about to tell belong to that last group. Their journey would be very different from Juan Garrido's. He crossed the water. I had seen the African coast. I remember people speaking languages the Europeans did not understand. I remember frightened men and women. Some had been captured in warfare. Some had been sold. Some had already passed through several hands before Europeans acquired them. They were not one people. They did not all speak the same language. Africa was not a single kingdom or culture. It was an enormous continent filled with kingdoms, communities, religions, languages, alliances, and rivalries. But at the coast, Europeans increasingly reduced these different human beings to one terrible category: property. I watched people being examined, I heard bargaining, I heard prices. Then I watched captives being taken toward ships. Some had probably never seen the ocean before. They could not have known what waited beyond it. I did. I had crossed that water before. The Atlantic was enormous. Once the coast disappeared, there was nothing but sea. The ships creaked constantly. The air below deck could become suffocating. There was sickness, fear, thirst, the smell of human waste, the sound of people praying. I heard prayers in European languages, and I heard prayers in African languages. Sometimes I heard singing, sometimes crying. Sometimes people simply sat in silence. One thing struck me more than anything else. I was a mouse. I could crawl beneath a barrel. I could climb a rope. I could hide behind a sack of grain. If I wanted to move, I moved. The humans around me could not. A mouse aboard that ship had more freedom than they did. I never forgot that. Hispaniola. By the early 1500s, enslaved Africans were already being brought into the Spanish Caribbean. So when you hear that Africans first came to America in 1619, remember, African history in the Americas was already decades old. Spanish colonization had begun long before the English established Virginia. I spent time on Hispaniola, the Caribbean island that today contains Haiti and the Dominican Republic. I watched the Spanish colonial world growing around me. I also saw what that expansion did to indigenous people: war, disease, forced labor, displacement, death. And increasingly, Africans were being brought across the Atlantic as enslaved laborers. They resisted too. In 1521 and 1522, enslaved Africans on Hispaniola had already participated in one of the earliest major African uprisings in the Americas. The Spanish knew enslaved people could rebel, yet they continued bringing more. Then in 1526, I heard sailors talking about a new expedition. The name I heard again and again was Lucas Vázquez de Ayllón, a colony on the mainland. Ayllón intended to establish a Spanish colony somewhere along the Atlantic coast of North America. Hundreds of people prepared to leave Hispaniola: settlers, sailors, priests, officials, women and children, and enslaved Africans. The expedition carried roughly 600 people, although the surviving records do not allow us to know every person's identity or status with certainty. We do know enslaved Africans were among them. I found a place aboard one of the ships. Mice are good at that. The Africans aboard were being taken north to provide labor for the colony. They had no choice. The ship sailed away from Hispaniola. Northward we went, toward a land the Spanish hoped would make them wealthy. Instead, almost everything went wrong. Disaster. Near the coast, one of the expedition's principal ships was lost. People survived, but precious supplies were lost. That was disastrous. A colony could not simply visit a market and buy more food. Everything had to be carried with them, grown, hunted, gathered, or obtained locally. And these settlers had arrived poorly prepared. Eventually, they established a settlement they called San Miguel de Gualdape. I cannot tell you precisely where it stood. No one today can. Historians have debated its location for generations. Some evidence points toward the coast of present-day Georgia. Other interpretations have placed it farther north in present-day South Carolina. Until archaeologists find convincing physical evidence, the precise location remains uncertain. But wherever San Miguel stood, I remember what happened there. Building San Miguel. The Africans were put to work. Land had to be cleared. Buildings had to be constructed. Food had to be found. A church was built. Shelter was desperately needed. Everyone understood that winter would eventually come. The Spaniards had imagined establishing a prosperous colony. Instead, San Miguel became a place of hunger. Supplies were scarce. People became sick. Food disappeared faster than it could be replaced. The surrounding indigenous peoples had their own communities and their own reasons to distrust these newcomers. And they had good reason. Earlier Spanish expeditions into the region had seized indigenous people and carried them away. The people living there had not forgotten. I watched the colony weaken, then its leader fell ill. In October 1526, Lucas Vázquez de Ayllón died. The man who had organized the expedition was gone, and San Miguel began tearing itself apart. The Spaniards turned on one another. After Ayllón's death, arguments became more dangerous. Different Spanish factions struggled for control. Men who were supposed to be building a colony began fighting among themselves. Some mutinied. Authorities were imprisoned. I hid beneath floors and listened. Fear had entered every corner of San Miguel. The colonists were hungry. They were sick. Their leader was dead. Some were fighting one another, and the enslaved Africans were watching, listening, waiting. Then came the moment the Spaniards had feared. The Africans rebelled. The Africans resisted. The surviving historical accounts do not tell us everything that happened. They do not preserve the names of the Africans who took part. They do not give us their conversations. They do not tell us exactly how they organized themselves, so I will not pretend to know. But the historical record does tell us that enslaved Africans took advantage of the turmoil and rebelled. One account describes them setting fire to the house of the leader of the Spanish mutiny, and some escaped. They ran away from San Miguel into a land the Spanish did not control. Think about the year. 1526, 93 years before 1619. Africans enslaved in an attempted European colony on the mainland of what would become the United States had already resisted their enslavers, and some had seized an opportunity to escape. Where did they go? I wish I could tell you. I cannot. Neither can historians. Later generations have suggested that some of the Africans may have found refuge with nearby indigenous peoples. We know that Africans and indigenous peoples would form alliances and communities together at other times and places in American history. It is certainly possible that something similar happened here. But possibility is not proof. The records simply lose track of these people. So imagine standing at the edge of San Miguel. Beyond the struggling settlement are forests, marshes, rivers, and indigenous communities. Behind you is slavery, ahead of you is uncertainty, and then the Africans disappear from the European record. Perhaps freedom waited for some of them, Perhaps it did not. We simply do not know. Sometimes the most accurate thing a historian can say is, we don't know. San Miguel collapses. The rebellion was not San Miguel's only problem. The colony was already dying. Disease continued spreading. Food remained scarce. The Spaniards were divided. Indigenous resistance created additional danger. More people died. By November, the survivors had had enough. They abandoned San Miguel de Gualdape. Of approximately 600 people who had participated in the expedition, only about 150 survived to return to Hispaniola, according to surviving accounts. The settlement had lasted only a matter of weeks. The Spanish dream had collapsed. The buildings were abandoned. The forest and marshland began reclaiming what humans had built. San Miguel disappeared, and eventually even its exact location was forgotten. But the Africans were not forgotten completely. I found my way aboard another ship. That is what mice do. I returned to the Caribbean. But I never forgot the Africans who did not return with us. Years became decades. Decades became centuries. Then humans began telling the history differently. One year became especially famous. 1619, that year matters. In 1619, Africans arrived at Point Comfort in the English colony of Virginia. Their arrival became part of the long development of racial slavery in the English colonies that eventually became the United States. But 1619 was not the beginning of African presence in North America, and it was not the first arrival of enslaved Africans in the territory that became the continental United States. Remember Juan Garrido? The free African man who reached Florida with Ponce de León in 1513. Remember the Africans who came with Ayllón in 1526? Remember San Miguel de Gualdape? And remember what happened there. 93 years before 1619. The people brought to San Miguel were not the first Africans in North America. That distinction matters. History should be accurate. But they appear to have been the first documented group of enslaved Africans brought to establish a European colony in what is now the continental United States. And almost immediately, their story became a story of resistance. They did not simply endure what was being done to them. Some fought back, some escaped, and then they disappeared beyond the reach of the surviving European records. Their names are gone. We do not know exactly where they came from. We do not know precisely where San Miguel stood. We do not know what happened to those who escaped, but we know enough to remember them. 1526. 93 years before 1619. A failed Spanish colony, a group of enslaved Africans, a rebellion, an escape, in one of the earliest chapters of African history in the land that would eventually become the United States. I was only a mouse. No historian remembered my name either. Perhaps that is why, after all these years, I remember theirs. Or rather, I remember the people whose names history did not preserve, and sometimes those are the names we should most wish we knew. Thank you for watching. Please like, share, and subscribe for more history. Most are never taught and remembered. As said by George Santana, those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it. There are many more videos coming about the history of slavery around the world and on every inhabited continent. There are also many more videos on the history of North America and the United States of America.
For students who want a deeper understanding, the book includes questions for reflection and questions for further research at the end of most chapters.